Hello everyone and welcome to the Middle East Today. I'm your host Maryam Saleh. The unrest in Syria continues in light of a growing global dispute over the situation in the country. Russia has been playing a prominent role in the crisis, and recently Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov visited Damascus and declared that Syrian President Bashar al-Assad is fully committed to stopping the unrest in the country from whatever source it comes. This also comes as terrorist attacks on the country's industry continue, the latest of which was an attack on an oil refinery in Syria's western city of Homs. Now, to get more on this issue and more, I am joined by Hisham Safleldeen. He is Managing Director of English.al-Akhbar.com. Also joined by Mr. Wada Al-Khatib, political analyst. He's joining us from Damascus. Let me begin with you, Mr. Al-Khatib. If you can tell us a little bit about the latest visit by the Russian foreign minister. It seemed that in his point of view, things were quite positive. Can we say that President Bashar al-Assad is willing to make further steps in the issue of reforms and in order to stop the unrest in the country?
Yes, I think President Assad has already mentioned back in April a program of reforms that was at that point just a certain vision. And he has since then in his government, they have worked on a schedule for those reforms. So I think he is totally committed from the beginning. I think if you go back to his speech in front of the People's Assembly back in April, we will see that the whole package of reforms, if you will, has been stated then, with the acknowledgement by President Assad that there was a delay that was not necessary, that was probably also caused by regional issues more so than internal issues. So I think many observers in Damascus would agree that the President and his close team are committed to a comprehensive program of reforms.
Okay, let me ask you, Mr. Safleldeen, when you look at what happened in the UN Security Council, does it seem to you that there's some kind of a new world order, if we may say, that's out of the hands of the United States?
Before I speak to that, I'd like to comment on what was said. I think the real problem is that we have to see what's going on in Syria in the context of two major movements going on. One is this kind of geopolitical war that's taking place and this reordering of powers in the Middle East. And the other is really the question of political authority in the Arab world. In terms of political authority, the problem is that these leaders don't have legitimacy themselves. It's not just about these ideas of steps of reform. It took a few days to change the constitution to change the age of the president when Bashar al-Assad came to power. It's taking them 11 years to make reforms. The question is really about the question of succession, for example. Nobody talks about that in Syria. That's a very important point. And I'm not trying to compare this to liberal regimes in the West. Look at even Iran. Somebody like President Ahmadinejad has managed to make it to the presidency. He was recently called to parliament to answer about economic issues. That would never happen in the Arab world under these regimes. There isn't this kind of understanding that the time of absolute authority should be gone. We should be able to protect ourselves from foreign intervention by consolidating internal pressure. There has to be a mechanism of transfer of power, I think, for real change to happen. I think it's a bit too late to just speak about that. The question of the constitution, for example, you can't draft a constitution if your own legitimacy is undermined. You need to elect a constitutional assembly. So all these things we have to keep in mind. Going to your point, it's very clear that the Western powers are using every means they have to hijack what's going on, to actually really make sure that the regime remains weak, because they're probably after the bigger prize, which is Iran. But it looks like the United States has failed this time to actually implement its own policies. So there is a rise of Russian and Chinese willingness to assert themselves more in the region because they feel more cornered. They've got the missile shield in Turkey. And I think the United States can't do it on its own anymore. This is done because of the resistance in Iraq, because of resistance in South Lebanon, because of resistance in Afghanistan. What the U.S. is trying to do now is to move and kind of corner this axis by resolving things in Afghanistan, by trying to bring Hamas closer to the Gulf states. But I think without a NATO kind of umbrella and a Russian kind of a blind eye, try, I don't think they will be able really to impose their will.
You're talking specifically about Syria. Now, what you said previously about the general perspective of the Arab world as a whole, and we see that even in Egypt, that hasn't come to place, also the issue of legitimacy. But still talking about the issue of Syria, do you think that the Arab League knew this change or this new balance of authority, if we may say, political authority in the region before they went to the UN Security Council? Didn't they know that this would fail?
Well, I was told, I don't know if it's true, that in the closed meetings of the Security Council, the Qatari representative tried to tell Russia that they're going to regret vetoing, and then the Russians said, who are you? I'm speaking to the big guys here. We can just, I don't know, I'm not going to say that they said we'll wipe Qatar off the map.
Yeah. But
something to the fact that the Arab League, unfortunately, is really working most closely with the United States, and they seem to be unable or incapable of actually measuring the new power situation on the ground. So I don't think they're more or less fixated on their internal, consolidating the internal power within the Arab League, and I don't think they really realize what's going on. So I don't think that the Arab League is an independent actor as such. I don't think they are.
Let me ask Mr. Al-Khatib, in light of what's just happened, do you think that things will take a more militarized turn and leaving no doors for any political solution or any perhaps national dialogue between the opposition and the Syrian government?
Yes, let me first go back to what Hisham has said about the issue of the constitution and the fact that it's too late. This is something that we've been hearing actually from the very beginning of the crisis in Syria. As far as the user manual that he's suggesting that there should be an elected constitutional assembly, I don't think there is one paradigm that we should follow in drafting a new constitution. The fact is that the situation in Syria in 2011 is very different from the situation in Syria back in 2000, where the amendment of the constitution took place for the age of the president. Now there has been election drafting committee, and I would really like to know the opinion of Mr. Hisham Safleldeen about the composition of that committee, and also about the fact that this committee has been working with a security situation on the ground that has been escalating, I think, at a very calculated pace by the Western powers that he acknowledged that they have been trying to hijack political dissent in Syria. I think what we are looking at is a very complex situation where we have to really separate the security issue from the political process.
Do you think, just in that point, do you think that Mr. Assad can actually gain a kind of legitimacy if he goes to the ballots? If the people get to really vote, and of course in a legitimate way, in order to legitimize a kind of rule for himself and create a new constitution which is for the people?
Well, I think he wants to. Under the right circumstances, and I think Qatar Foundation, and we know what Qatar Foundation is, has commissioned a poll, an opinion poll by a Western polling agency that found out only a month ago that about 55 to 60% of the population of Syria would like to see Assad remain in power. And again, this is a poll that was conducted by a Western agency. I think he's eager to be probably the first president of Syria that is elected in a presidential election where you have many candidates, where the elections are transparent and everyone can verify their authenticity. So he is willing and he is eager, I think.
Now we're joined by Mr. Vyacheslav Matusov. He's former counselor to Washington. Do you think that Russia and China's role, although it's quite controversial, do you think that it would lead Bashar Assad to make more efforts on implementing reforms?
Well, a Russian decision is absolutely clear. We support any decision, any reforms that are arranged by Syrian government, Syrian authority, Syrian people, because with no external intervention in their internal affairs. I think that League of Arab States can play positive role in case with this principle will be respected. If the League of Arab States will try to intervene in the internal affairs of Syria under pressure of the United States of America, I think it will be don't bring any good things, not to a solution, not to anything. I remark that now the United States arranged another wave of anti-Syrian, anti-Russian, anti-Chinese company all over the world. It is a global company discrediting, falsificating position, disillusion of Arab and Islamic people. I think that now they are trying to use all informational resources to bring Syria to the knees, to achieve the same goals, but another means. I think we should work very correctly and in connection with the Russian Federation, with Russian Foreign Ministry. I think coordination of all political, diplomatical steps are very, very important right now. Russia supporting reforms in Syria in right way, depending on American stance. I think that America will try and do its best to spoil Russian efforts, Syrian efforts, to convert all these efforts to a new American NATO aggression against another Arabic country. I think it is a dangerous inclination.
Do you think that all sides have left no room for a political solution, and that what's coming up is taking a militarized turn?
Yeah, I think that Russia will continue their efforts to bring up to Security Council an acceptable form of Security Council resolution, because it will be excluded any signs of intervention in internal affairs, any signs of permitting in any form intervention, military intervention, and prohibiting supplying weapons to opposition. We can stop opposition from using weaponry.
Well, is Russia settling scores with the United States?
I think that a military operation inside Syria will be met with Syrian army, with Syrian security forces. But using security forces, armed forces in Syrian territory, don't acceptable by international community. So when Western countries, United States, supply opposition with weaponry, they provoke Syrian authorities to using force to give order for Syrian people. So I think it is a dramatic situation. It needs intervention on the name of Security Council, League of Arab States, neighbor countries. I think that the Turkish role is very, very important. Now Erdogan today said that he rejects acceptance Syrian authority. Once again, he accelerating intervention. He doesn't accept Syrian authority and persists on its resignation. I think it is American play from League of Arab States, from Turkey, from others. I think this play of diplomatic and political play from the United States should be stopped.
All right, I want to thank Mr. Matusal for joining us from Moscow. Let me come back to our guests here. Let me go to Mr. Al-Khatib in Damascus. What do you think the Arab League might do now? Do you think that it will try to legitimize some kind of military action against Syria?
Well, the Arab League is in a quandary right now. I think you have two camps in that league, one that is led by the Gulf countries and the other by what I may call the reluctant countries that do not really want to intervene more than what they have done. It will be interesting to see what happens on Sunday, especially at the meeting of the Arab League was postponed so that the Gulf countries can meet on Saturday. I think any attempt at legitimizing military action in Syria by the Arab League will be a grave mistake on the part of those countries. And I think the veto of Russia and China will make some member countries more hesitant than they were before about taking extra measures against Syria.
Yes, now, Mr. Al-Khatib, don't you think... Yes, the fact that there is military action from the government to try to wipe out any military presence of the armed gangs or the armed groups in the opposition areas, doesn't that also pave the way for a military solution to the crisis and not a political one?
There is no military solution for the crisis. The military solution in and of itself cannot resolve the issues that Syria needs to resolve internally. As far as the security situation, if you want to start a political process, you need to have some stability on the ground. But all indications are that those groups are not really interested in any political process. And so it is, again, imperative upon the Syrian government to clear the areas that some of these groups have been controlling for some time, and to get back immediately to the table to encourage even more the opposition parties to actually come and negotiate with the government. It's kind of interesting because the government has been calling for opposition figures from the very beginning to sit down and talk. And we have seen reluctance on the part of various spectrums of the oppositions, and this reluctance, I think, is not because of their own decisions. I think it's because they have been pressured by Turkey, by the Gulf countries, by the United States, by the West, not to engage the Syrian government in any dialogue.
Yes. Do you think that the French president's call for a Friends of Syria committee, isn't that tantamount to a kind of militarized action to help the opposition and even arm them?
Well, I think the problem is, you have Russia and China on one side. It's become too close to the regime, and you've got the Western powers that are very close to the opposition, and both these camps have lost credibility in terms of being an honest broker, so to speak. I think the solution has to be, and so has the Arab League, to bring in possibly other players, maybe Brazil, maybe other countries, and also some Arab countries, to try to negotiate a transfer of power. The gangs are, the regime has its own gangs. The regime is also engaging in brutal oppression of people, and the armed groups are also unfortunately engaging in very problematic and sometimes sectarian actions. So the military solution continues to be an option for the regime. It should stop being so. And I think maybe if we can try to find out a promise of a transition to someone else's power, even if it's a longer period, but there has to be a clear commitment by the president that I will be a transition for the sake of Syria, not for anything else. People like Nelson Mandela spent 25 years in prison. They came out, they ruled, and after 8 years they're willing to let go. So do let go, but make sure, of course, that you protect Syria against foreign intervention and against, of course, hitting on the resistance forces that depend on the regime. I think what should happen.
Now, it seems that even the opposition itself and the Western states are not all that, don't see eye to eye when it comes to how we're going to deal with the situation in Syria, and the Arab League as well. You think they have really left no room for any political solution?
I think the Western powers are not interested in a political solution. I agree with that. I think what they want is to ensure that the regime continues to be weak, so that they could possibly pressure it should they want to have a confrontation with Iran, or should they, or should Israel engage in war, for example, in Lebanon. It's true that they don't want, I think, a political solution, but it's about time that we stop thinking too much about what they want and try to fix and clean our own house. For far too long, Iraq has been destroyed under war. Now Syria is being eaten up in different parts, and part of the blame has to lie with the intransigence, in my opinion, of the regimes that we have. We have to find a new contract that, hopefully brings in dispossessed and impoverished people and gives them a say in what's going to happen next.
Now, Mr. Al-Khatib, do you think that closing the U.S. Embassy in Damascus and the departure of several Western diplomats, how can that affect and impact the Syrian government, and how can sanctions, of course, what kind of an economical impact do you think they will have on the country?
Well, let me just please first go back to the issue of the transfer of power, transition of power. I think that this cannot be a precondition for a process. I think the principle of power transition through political process, through democratic elections, is a principle that we should all adhere to, and that the Syrian people and the Syrian government should embrace sincerely. But at this stage, to say that there is a need for a transition of power, as if the whole issue is simply who holds power, I think is oversimplistic, with all due respect. When we come back to the issue of the closing of the embassies, the American embassy in Damascus has practically declared that they're closing their doors early in January. The timing itself is kind of interesting. The reasons that they have given the Syrian government are security reasons related to the fact that the Syrian government rejected closing certain roads that around the embassy that the American embassy asked for. As for the other embassies, I think this is more of a diplomatic show of statesmanship. I don't think it will have any effect now on the ground. We have to wait and see what actual steps will be taken in ways of economic and political pressures on Syria. I think the West and the camp that the West is leading is now trying to find some creative ways, if you will, to deal with Syria. And I think the strength of the Chinese and the Russian position, and also of the BRICS countries, have made the options very limited. I mean, this is not the same West of 1990. This is not even the same West of 2003. And so I think they have options that are limited. They can definitely hurt a lot, but they're not as capable as they used to be. And I think I agree with Hashim that it might be a good idea to bring, somebody like Brazil or South Africa or India to be some sort of a broker. But I want to go back to Russia. I mean, Russia has, from the very beginning, tried to embrace the opposition. And I think they have done this in good intention. And I repeat that the oppositions have lost a chance.
Yes, this is something I wanted to ask you. What are the intentions of China and Russia? You think Russia is settling old scores with the United States?
I think it's settling upcoming scores. Russia is a rising power of sorts. They're also concerned about some of the minorities that exist within the Russian Confederation. They've got the missile shield, the NATO at its doorstep. So they're really concerned about the United States at a stage when the United States itself is becoming weaker of some sorts, reasserting itself in the region and cornering Russia in one place, not the other. So I think the Russian interest is making sure that whatever happened in Libya, because they kind of went along with what the NATO did in Libya in a way, and they didn't get much out of that, and they realized that at the end of the game they didn't get much out of it. So the Russian decision in Syria has to do with protecting its borders from increasing U.S. influence with a rising star like Russia, especially now that Putin is also coming to power. They need to feel strong. That's, I think, and of course they've had historic relationship with Syria as well, but I think that is the reason why Russia is holding ground, and they will continue to do so until they fear that this kind of threat is receded more.
Well, wonderful. That wraps up our edition for today. Mr. Hisham Safleldeen from English.alakhbar.com. I want to thank you very much for being with us. I want to thank Mr. Al-Khatib also joining us from Damascus. We also have Mr. Matusov from Moscow. Our email is metoday@presstv.com. Stay with Press TV. Goodbye for now.